All right, thanks to everyone who's joining. I think we're going to get started. I'd like to welcome you to today's event on fashion and sustainability. I'm Karen King, founder and CEO of Fronterra Global Advisory, a boutique international trade consulting firm. I'm thrilled to moderate today's panel of experts who will help us explore the intersection of fashion and sustainability. The presenters will cover these topics from a variety of perspectives based on their work and research. This will include legal, policy, private industry, nonprofit, and grassroots viewpoints. They have put together some really great content today, which I'm excited to share with you. Just a couple of administrative items before we jump in. First, I encourage you to add any questions for the panelists into the chat. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end of the presentation when videos for participants can also be turned on. If you have any technical issues, please try to send me a private chat message and I will do my best to help you. A copy of today's presentation will be available in a link that I will post in the chat, and I will also post a link to the full bios for the presenters. I'd also like to take a minute to thank our sponsors for today's event, World Trade Week NYC, the Global Chamber, and the Organization of Women in International Trade, New York. I'll also be posting links to these great organizations in the chat if you'd like to learn more about them. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our esteemed panelists. Andrea Reyes is an experienced community organizer running the NYC Fair Trade Coalition, a 501c3, which she grew from 20 business members to 100 business members and over 100 fair trade advocates. She's an adjunct instructor at the Fashion Institute of Technology and LIM College teaching global sourcing, corporate social responsibility, and sustainability. She's a published author with Bloomsbury Publishing and has written college-level coursework. Elizabeth Hodur is a graduate of FIT's Marketing International Trade Program and their Fashion Buying and Merchandising Program. Since that time, Elizabeth has held key international trade-related positions within the fashion industry, including International Operations Manager at Donna Karan International, Import Manager at Ajmi Apparel Group, International Trade Director at Warnaco Incorporated, and International Trade Director at Ann Inc., the parent company of Ann Taylor, Loft, and Lewin Gray. She is currently the Senior Director of International Trade at Ascena. Elizabeth is also a licensed U.S. Customs broker who served on the FIT Marketing International Trade Advisory Board in 2013 and has co-chaired the Women's Networking Group at the Princeton Club of New York since 2018. Dr. Hanna C. Norburg is an independent researcher and trade policy advisor. She is the founder of TradeEconomista.com and TradeExperts.org, the co-founder of TradePolicyResearchForum.org, and the co-director of DigitalTradePolicy.org. She specializes in research related to trade policy and conducting training and teaching and mastermind events for policymakers and organizations looking to understand the underlying issues and dynamics of modern trade topics and find the best way to deal with them from a policy perspective. Hanna holds a PhD in international economics from Lund University in Sweden. Apart from academic research, she has substantial experience in applied economics, doing numerous trade policy impact assessment projects for the European Commission, ECFIN, the OECD, the WTO, and national governments. Hanna also has considerable practical experience with implementing FTAs, surveying SMEs, and studying economic development through private-public partnerships. Her primary academic research interests are trade policy, economic integration, sustainable development, digital trade, data flows, and blockchain. And last but not least, we have Sara Schoenfeld, who is the founder and CEO of the Trade Impact Foundation, a nonprofit organization seeking to understand the impact of international trade on peace and global human rights, and to optimize the positive impact. Sara also leads the Customs and International Trade Law practice at Cameron, Unsick, Sonaker, and Klein PC. Sara has more than 5 years of experience as an international trade consultant at Ernst & Young, advising multinational corporations, including top fashion companies, on international trade rules and regulations, strategic planning, compliance and risk assessment, and controversy. Sara is on the board of OIT New York, has authored and co-authored various articles on trade remedies, trade policy, customs valuation, and free trade agreements, and is an experienced speaker on topics of international trade law, operations, and policy. Sara received her undergraduate degree in accounting from Yeshiva University and her law degree from Fordham University. She is admitted to the New York State Bar. Okay, great. We are going to kick things off with the top 5 sustainability myths with Andrea Reyes. Andrea, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Karen. Good morning, everyone. I'm so excited to chat with you guys today. I have to say, I haven't done a Zoom panel in about a month or two, which all of you are probably like, how did you get away with this? And it's because we actually opened a store. We opened a store in East Harlem called the Sustainable Fashion Community Center. So first I wanted to kick it off by welcoming you all, if you're in the neighborhood, to come and swap with us, because it's a clothing swap store combined with workshops and a member-led pop-up. So I'm very excited to be on the SUSTAIN panel and kind of get back into my roots of educating and sharing information about sustainability. So let's jump right in. Karen, if you want to go to the next slide. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. It really, helped set the scene of what we're going to go over today. And, my role as an educator teaching at FIT and LIM, my job is to meet students where they're at, customers where they're at, anyone who is maybe starting their journey into sustainability, because it's certainly a journey. We can't learn everything in one lesson. And even for myself, I'm constantly learning. And the sustainable fashion industry is very humbling, because as soon as I think I know something, new information or new technology comes out, that puts me right in my place, knowing that, you can't be sustainable. You can only be more sustainable. And that's one of those myths that I want to dispel right now. So many organizations, they throw out there, well, we're sustainable. And I'm like, well, what does that mean to you? And I love this definition, able to endure without interruption or without failing for the long-term future. Now, there are a number of definitions for sustainability, but I like to think of it as a spectrum. I like to think that we can start with our own behavior, and then hopefully we move into discussing with our friends and family how we can be more sustainable. And certainly then going into our workplace or the industries that we work within and seeing how we can incorporate more sustainable practices into our business. And I think these words are really important because one fact, this is a bonus myth, I guess, is that so many people claim that the fashion industry is the #2 polluter in the world. And that's such an easy fact to spit out and for people to hold on to and to tell other people. But it's really hard to quantify because the fashion industry is omnipresent in a lot of ways. We think about fashion may start with farming, right? So are we taking stats and facts from farming all the way to transportation? So are we taking information from there and claiming that's the #2 polluter? So I really invite anyone who's talking about sustainability to try and be as factual as possible, but then also, be careful of your language. So now I've changed my way of saying the fashion industry is one of the largest polluters in the world, right? That slight difference may lead to you being more credible or less credible. So if you can go to the next slide, Karen. Thank you. And the next myth is that sustainability is much more than just the environment. That's also a misconception. Many people believe that when we talk about sustainability, we're only talking about the environment. And one of the very basic tenets or principles of sustainability is the triple bottom line. So people, planet, profit. So whenever I'm conducting any business, I'm taking the environmental implications into account, the societal implications, and absolutely the financial ones, because we do live primarily in a capitalistic world where money is still, oh so important. So those three things are very important to balance instead of just thinking of the singular bottom line financially. We really want to move business and industry to think about this triple bottom line. You can go to the next slide. And the next myth is that sustainability or sustainable fashion is expensive. And I love this little chart here. And we'll go down to the first one. Value and take good care of the clothes you've already owned. So that is the first way that you can be a conscious consumer or a sustainable fashion consumer. And after that, shop less, choose better, only buy pieces you love. And that's why we opened the swap shop, right? It helps people bring their items that they don't use anymore. We say items they no longer love and pick up some new to them threads. So we're okay with somebody coming in and bringing in 10 H&M items and then taking 10 new H&M items, as long as they're not going and buying new from the store H&M items, right? We really want to pull back the reins from fast fashion because it's been very detrimental to our planet. And a fun fact is, each year we make 150 billion garments, 150 billion garments. It's really hard to wrap our head around. That's how many are produced each year, even though we have about 7.8 billion people on the planet. So we really need to pull back the amount of production and things that we are producing that may be worn an average of 7 to 10 times before they're thrown in a landfill. So those numbers are quite large and quite staggering. If you could go to the next slide, Karen. And forgive me if I'm going a little fast. I definitely want to get all of this information in, and hopefully this is just enough to spark your interest and go do some more research. So from teaching sustainability at LAM College, I really had this aha moment when I realized that natural isn't always best, meaning that a natural fiber, so cotton, flax, which is linen or hemp, even though I love hemp, isn't always necessarily better than a synthetic fabric, say polyester. And we have to think of this as how it's produced. So cotton can take a lot of water, a lot of land. It can be very unpredictable based on climate change and things like that, as opposed to say polyester can be produced in a factory that may be a carbon neutral factory, or it may be a factory that's using renewable resources. We also have to think about how many costs per wear or how often we're wearing these things. I'd like to tell the story that I spent probably too much money for a fair trade organic cotton legging that within the year it had little holes in it, right? I loved it a little too hard. But that polyester item from Nike that say I bought on a website like ThredUp that does secondhand clothing, those are virtually indestructible. So those may last me many more years and years and years. So the difference between cotton and polyester, I think a lot of the time on the item that I'm purchasing. So maybe my athleisure, things that I'm gonna wear every other day, maybe I'm gonna go for a synthetic secondhand option, but maybe things that are closest to my skin, like my intimate apparel, I'm gonna spend a little bit more and do that organic cotton fair trade item. You can go to the next slide. And greenwashing. So this kind of connects back to the first slide talking about how brands, claim to be sustainable. And we have to be very careful of any brands claiming that they are doing everything perfectly. And this goes in line with one of the fair trade principles. Another thing I invite you to explore, the fair trade principles. So transparency and accountability. So I think of this a lot in terms that if a company is saying, we're sustainable, we have a closed loop system, we are doing everything that we can to be conscious of the environment, and maybe leaving out the people part. A lot of them do sometimes. So I would just say be careful of marketing, right? Be careful of marketing, because any company that isn't claiming what they could do better is essentially greenwashing, because we can all do better. Oh, and here's this dreaded truck that's in my backyard in Harlem. So definitely don't get tricked, empower yourself by learning more, stay conscious, stay woke about all the new technology, all the information that's coming out, and be transparent with yourself, and be okay that you're not going to get it right every single time. But the important part is that you just go forth and try to constantly push your ethics forward. And the next slide. And I love this quote by Stella McCartney. So the starting point is not design, the starting point is sustainability. And in your sustainability journey, it's not important where you start and where you end, but it's the fact that you start somewhere. So many brands come to me and say, I want to start 100% fair trade or 100% sustainable fashion line. And I say, good luck to you, sir. It's not possible. You don't know your supply chain yet. You don't know what the customer is going to gravitate towards. So try and find what your true north is. Maybe it's vegan, maybe it's artisanal, maybe it's secondhand. There's so much going on in the sustainable fashion world. And then slowly, as you find out who your customer is and build on to what you're actually doing in your business plan, then go back to that rule of constantly pushing your ethics forward. And I believe the last slide. So definitely reach out to me. This is my handles on Instagram. As I mentioned, the New York City Fair Trade Coalition, we just opened a store in East Harlem. We're hoping that is one of many sustainable fashion community centers. And what it's all about at the NYC FTC, it's about listening, learning, and joining. So we really hope that you reach out. And yeah, thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I'd also encourage our panelists, presenters, feel free to drop your contact information or handles in the chat as well, so all the participants can see that. And thank you so much. Okay, next up is a presentation on seeking sustainable fashion, the impact of tariffs, with Elizabeth Hodur, who is the Senior Director of International Trade at Ascena.
I'm going to take a moment to share my screen.
And I'd also encourage all of our participants, in addition to adding questions into the chat, please let us know where you're joining from or if there's any other information you'd like to share with everyone. Take it away, Elizabeth.
Now we're going to talk about sustainable fashion from the impact of business and tariffs. But first, are we on the cusp of a style revolution? Witness the iconic flapper dress of the 1920s, which was a reaction to the Spanish flu coupled with the end of World War I. Societal norms were quickly shifting, and the slim silhouette of the flapper both reflected and declared women's newfound freedom. As we move into our new normal, we're thinking about what do we wear, but also, does it align with our values? The New York Times is calling this a quandary, while Vogue is reporting a return to high fashion. NPR says, ditch fast fashion, create a sustainable closet. And the Wall Street Journal says, this is what post-pandemic fashion is going to look like. They note, however, that sustainability at scale calls for a major business overhaul. So we are moving more into the ethos of credibility, trustworthiness, and reputation. And to that end, we say there's not only a demand for fashion, there's a demand of fashion. Let's face it, we all wear clothing. And as of November 2020, US apparel imports have pretty much rebounded since our pre-pandemic levels. But now consumers are seeking sustainably and ethically sourced products. And fashion is leading the way, whether we're investing in our CSR programs or harnessing new technologies. So we posit that sustainability is naturally about the environmental impact, but it's also about business continuity. And to that end, we want to discuss the perspective of tariffs. So as you may know, a tariff is also called duty, and this is when you must pay the customs authority for goods that are being imported into that country. We could say that fashions are in fact fashionable. The US fashion industry represents 6% of overall import volumes, yet we pay the lion's share of these duties. In addition to these high baseline tariffs, we must pay additional tariffs for the 301 tariff, which is a tariff assessed on many fashion products of up to 25% when those items are made in China. And as you may know, China is a key supplier to the fashion industry. As of November 2020, China was responsible for just shy of 40% of US apparel imports, looking at it through the lens of quantity. In addition, there's a potential new tariff on the horizon, a US retaliation on the digital service tax. The DST is a tax levied by foreign governments on non-resident companies connected to their digital services. And this proposed retaliatory tariff would be up to 25% from several countries targeting fashion items. And this is currently in the public notice and comment period. So with all of these heavy tariff burdens, there are a few programs that importers can take advantage of to compliantly reduce their duties. Unfortunately, a few of these programs have expired. The first is the Generalized System of Preferences, which is the oldest and largest free trade agreement. It was implemented in 1976 and encouraged trade with 119 beneficiary countries, eliminating duty on thousands of products. To the detriment of the fashion industry, India and Turkey were removed from this program in 2019, and then at the end of last year, it expired. Renewal is being considered by Congress. In addition, there is the Miscellaneous Tariff Bill, or MTB, which allows about 3,000 products to be imported either at zero or reduced duties. And the majority of these products were also subject to those 301 tariffs. So as you can imagine, the MTB was very important to help importers mitigate the effect of those 301 tariffs. Unfortunately, this too has expired, renewal being considered by Congress. And finally, there's the 301 tariff exclusion, where certain products were allowed to not pay those 301 duties for a set period of time. Those have also expired. So with all of this very heavy tariff burden weighing down the fashion industry, we're saying that fashion is having a hard time fitting into its skinny jeans. So who pays for US tariffs? Well, contrary to what some tweets may have you believe, it's indeed the US consumer. In fact, looking at the 301 tariffs alone, US companies and consumers have paid over $30 billion since its inception in 2018. There's also a pink tax. Products marketed to women cost 7% more than similar products marketed to men. And one key reason for this is because of the higher tariffs that are levied on women's products. For something as fundamental as underwear, men have to pay less than women. A 2015 study showed that the average duty for men's apparel is just shy of 12%, where women have to pay over 15% for their apparel duty. Women pay more than $1,300 annually for these similar products. And this cost inequality starts very early. It starts in childhood, where toys that are traditionally marketed towards girls cost up to 13% more than those marketed towards boys. And by the time a woman reaches age 50, she has paid close to $68,000 as a result of this pink tax. So what to do? It's becoming an increasingly complex and costly environment, but we do have a few tools. Tariff engineering, first sale for export, free trade agreements, duty drawback. I do want to say that record keeping is key for participation in any of these programs. While your product may very well qualify for one of these programs, you must be able to substantiate that through your documentation. So tariff engineering is when you modify a product's characteristics to be eligible for a reduced duty classification. This was rooted in an 1881 Supreme Court case where the importer mixed molasses into his sugar to change the color and quality of the sugar. The Supreme Court agreed with what the importer did. He won the case and tariff engineering was born. A classic example for the fashion industry is when Converse added textile flocking to the soles of their sneakers, and that allowed them to import those sneakers at 3% instead of a very costly 37.5%. First sale for export is another area in which fashion is leading the way, and this is very much inspired by that heavy tariff duty that's applied to fashionable products. In a first sale transaction, the basis for valuation is applied to the sale between the factory and the middleman versus the middleman and the importer. Naturally, there are rules that go along with this program. It must be an arm's length transaction. It must be clearly destined for export to the United States, and it must be a bona fide sale for export. Free trade agreements are agreements that the US enters into with either one or a group of countries. And this allows for not only facilitated trading, but reduced or free duties. FTAs usually require at least one of the following rules. First, it must be shipped direct from origin to the US. And the product must be yarn forward, where the yarn is spun in that qualifying country, and all processes forward then take place in that country. When the fabric is cut and the apparel is sewn in that country. When a qualifying country adds their own value to the product, whether it's by sourcing components from that country, the value of the labor, or in certain cases, you can apply facets of the overhead to this regional value content. A tariff shift is when a product changes its nature from one classification to another within the eligible country. And finally, there's short supply fabrics, which allows an importer to source fabrics from all over the world if they're deemed not available in commercial quantities in a timely manner. There are a number of FTAs that pertain to the fashion industry. Some of the most important ones are DR-CAFTA, the Dominican Republic, Central America FTA, Jordan, and USMCA, formerly known as NAFTA. Duty drawback will allow an importer to recoup up to 99% of their duties when the product is destroyed or exported. So in closing, we're saying that in sustainably shifting to the new normal, tariffs are a key component of cost. And so if you can figure out ways to compliantly lower your duties and pass those savings on to your customer, you will not only service your customer, but you will help sustain your business.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully we have Hanna with us on the phone. Are you there?
I hope so.
Okay, perfect.
Oh,
yes.
Oh, how exciting. Great.
Thank
yeah,
you.
We have this freak power outing, and it also took the 4G out. So
Wow.
all I have now is a 3G and a phone line. So, you know, it's feeling very pre-COVID, calling into meetings.
We're making it work. So I'll pass it over to you. I know you're going to talk about trade policy, sustainability, and blockchain.
Exactly. Thank you so much. And that was great that Elizabeth went before me, because she talks about tariffs, which is in trade agreements, and I'm going to talk about other parts. So that works really well. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be on this event here for OIT today in New York. My name is Hanna Norburg. I'm a trade economist. I'm an independent trade policy advisor. I'm based in Sweden, and I've spent the last 15 years researching, analyzing assessing and advising governments on matters related to international trade policy. Do we have the first slide up?
Yes.
Excellent. So trade is behind pretty much everything we see and buy, and trade policy is about writing those rules for how it's done. It is a very powerful thing. We don't often think about this, but it is a really powerful thing because the policy we put together doesn't just have an effect on, us as consumers and producers in our own country, but it can have implications for hundreds of millions of people and how they interact and earn their living, and whether we choose to sort of level the playing field for those who choose to work in a sustainable way, environmentally friendly or so. And we handle these issues to the best of our ability in trade agreements, as Elizabeth was talking about. So on a global level, we work on a multilateral basis, and those issues are handled at the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in Switzerland, where we have 164 member countries, or we do it pluri or bilaterally or trilaterally, which is the case for NAFTA, USMCA, where US, Mexico, and Canada, or the CPTPP. Karen also talked about with developing countries, they don't have to have an FTA per se, but they have since 1974 been given access to the American market with lower tariffs through the generalized scheme of preferences, the GSPs. And this is, for example, how many of the world's developing countries can produce and export cotton or clothing to the American markets. The GSPs are given on certain conditions, like keeping up labor rights or human rights and so on. And just as an example, the EU also has them, and they have now put Myanmar and the Philippines on notice for violating human rights. So if we change to the second slide. So sustainability is a very broad term that in essence means development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It's also an evolving term, and it means different things to different people and at different times. It changes as we learn and understand more about the supply chains, right? But it also, it spans three areas, basically. It's the environmental sustainability, it's economic, and it's social. And how do we handle them in trade policy? Well, since the past 5 years or so, trade policy has actively developed tools for handling these issues related to sustainability. It used to be that we mostly talked about tariffs, but now policymakers are aware and they're doing the best they can given the tools that they have access to. There's much more to be done, but not everything can be solved through trade policy either. But it's a very active conversation that's going on. So we do it either through the trade agreements, as I mentioned earlier, the new NAFTA, which is the USMCA, for example, they have a chapter on labor rights, minimum wages, and the right to unionize, for example. Or we have special situations such as the forced labor allegations in China, where you need to bring in another set of rules. So you use it from foreign affairs and bring on sanctions, like the US, Canada, UK, and EU did on Chinese officials for human rights abuses against the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang, where actually 20% of all the world's cotton comes from. Or there's also another case, and that's where companies in the West have not lived up to their commitments to firms in developing countries, like some American retailers did during the COVID pandemic and said, well, this is late because it didn't come here on time, so you have to pay for it yourself. And then we need to, as policymakers, we need to find new ways for them to write the rules for that. But as I said, sustainability is a moving target. And we're talking about conditions for production here, but we could also look at conditions for transportation or other parts of the chain and have opinions on whether or not those are sustainable. And for that, wouldn't it be really cool if we had access to a lot more information about the supply chain that brought us our items of fashion here? Wouldn't it be cool if there was like transparency along the whole process? Well, it just so happens that there is such a tool. We switch to the third one. Thank you. Karen. So if we put supply chains on blockchain, that means we could have more information available, we could have the information that is better, that is trustworthy, that is transparent and traceable. And that means that we as consumers can make much more informed decisions about what to buy. And producers would also have more information about what we want to buy when we purchase something. Because remember, money makes the world go around. And we do vote every day using our wallets. And that's how we, in the very most powerful way there is, interact with others globally. So the main problem for consumers now is the lack of information that we have access to. When shopping for clothes, we just have access to the reputation of the retailer and whatever information they put on the tag to go on when we make our pick. And we just have to trust that that information is correct. And why is that? Why do we have that problem? Because when we ship an item in trade, we don't just ship that, we ship the information that goes with it. And at the moment, that is very expensive. So I did a project with Mask, the big shipping industry firm in Copenhagen. And at the time, they had a PhD student who was working on quantifying the cost of information. And she was looking at avocados going from Mombasa in Kenya to Rotterdam in Holland. And at that time, she wasn't finished with the assertiveness, but she found that the assertion that the cost of just the paperwork, just the information to come with the avocados was 3 times as costly as the transportation. And so that's why these costs are really high, and this is where blockchain can help. So by having access to much more information, consumers can learn more, and we are empowered to make more informed decisions about the sustainability, not just in the making of the fiber or the piece of the clothing, but also in other issues like CO2 emissions or working conditions along the entire value chain. I mean, really from the cotton bud all the way to when we actually buy it. And we're already seeing these developments in the food sector. So in France, you can use your smartphone to find out everything about a piece of chicken that you want to buy in the supermarket. You just blip a sticker and you can find out where it was hatched, when it was slaughtered, what kind of food it ate, if it had gotten antibiotics, if it had been kept cool since it was slaughtered, and so on. And this information is traceable and something that you can check. And we're seeing it in specific products too. We're seeing these developments, which are really cool. So there's chocolate that you can buy, and once you bought it, you can log in. And when you log in, you get these tokens, and then you can find out a lot more about the product. But you can also use the token to either pay the farmer extra money or to plant some trees in the nearby rainforest. And so that's how you can make your purchases more sustainable. I think that's super cool. So having access to much more and much better information makes both trade policymakers and us consumers much more empowered and powerful. Empowered because we can easily find out more about the products we're considering buying, and powerful because these producers who want our businesses will have incentives to update their supply chains according to our preferences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hanna. Okay, now we're gonna pass it over to Sara Schoenfeld, who will talk about promoting sustainability in the fashion industry, US focused on forced labor and environmental issues. And I think she's going to help to pull it all together for us. And thank you so much, Sara.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks everybody. Thanks a lot. So let's jump into it, starting off with forced labor within the US. Who makes your clothing? So when you are a consumer and you're looking in your closet, I challenge you to not look at the brand names, but rather think more at a basic level. Who is making your clothing that sits in your closet? Who put together the clothes? Who spun the yarn? Who sourced the cotton, etc.? Who, when you go to the store, when you're looking at the individual garments, not only to look again at the brand names, but actually think about, this is a product. Somehow it was made, and somehow it ended up in the store at my door. So thinking about the working conditions, thinking about the workers' rights. And what I would argue is most important, thinking about whether that labor was conducted on a voluntary basis. Thanks, Karen. So what do you need to know about forced labor within the fashion industry specifically? So you need to begin by understanding that the supply chains are complex, and do not underestimate that. You'll have one garment that will cross a number of borders potentially, that will typically touch various actors, various companies, specifically a number of human beings, if you look at it from the labor perspective, before that garment is completed and imported into the country of consumption. Heightened enforcement. We are seeing a huge emphasis on forced labor within the US, which is a welcome development. And it's important to understand the context of that heightened enforcement. So first of all, in name, forced labor was outlawed within the US since 1930, from the Tariff Act of 1930. However, there was a very broad exception within that act for a consumptive demand exception, which means that if in the US we don't produce enough of that product, essentially Customs and Border Protection would have a lot of difficulty in working on that violation. So what changed? So in 2015, the Trade Facilitation Act of 2015 was implemented in 2016, and what happened was they got rid of that exception essentially. And when you remove that exception, now there's a huge amount of leeway for Customs and Border Protection to now really implement the core of what it is in terms of forced labor violations. So how are we seeing that come out? Typically, we see it with regards to withhold and release orders, which means that if Customs and Border Protection has even a reasonable indication that a garment was made with forced labor, they can stop it at the border. They can stop the goods, the shipment at the border, and require additional information for the importer to then prove the point that, no, this was not made with forced labor. But unfortunately, that is such a difficult thing to do. We're seeing a lot of dynamic requirements in terms of the compliance, in terms of, establishing that forced labor is not at play with regards to the manufacturing. And really, honestly, there's just a bit of confusion because of the nature of the novelty and as well as the complexity of the supply chains. Bipartisan support. So actually there is legislation that's being considered in Congress that goes a bit further, specifically with regard to the Xinjiang region and goods that are manufactured there. So I'm sure you've seen there's a lot of emphasis on products within the fashion industry, right, that are produced using the cotton that is manufactured in that region by the Uyghur population under allegations according to the US. So I think what I would say on that piece is that it's important to monitor this legislation, which essentially, if passed, would impose a stricter standard where there would be a rebuttable presumption on any goods coming in from that region. So essentially, if you think about cotton, that's sourced from the Xinjiang region, that's then going into the supply chain, dispersed, difficult to track in some ways, easier to track in other ways. But throughout China, and as the other panelists alluded to, cotton is not in supply all over the world. There are certain limited sources. So it's quite a difficult issue. And I think if you see that legislation go through and you move the liability even further onto the importer to take that proactive action, we're going to see a lot more resources expended on that effort. Ongoing efforts of private and public actors. So speaking to that point a bit more, there's really been so much progress in terms of both public and private actors taking action on forced labor and trying to root it out of their supply chains. I think everyone is in agreement. We don't want forced labor within our supply chain, but it's not so simple to just snap your fingers and be rid of it. There are a ton of obstacles to progress. Some of it is the fact that victims don't have much ability to report the violations. Of course, the complexity of the supply chains leads to lack of transparency, specifically in the fashion industry with so many different processings going on. And finally, there is that aspect of the different stakeholders at play. You have nonprofits, you have the private companies, you have the government, and everyone's trying to go in the same direction. But there are points where we conflict, and where it does turn into this antagonistic relationship. And I'd really love to see it become a bit more collaborative, which in some instances we're seeing that already. Karen, you can go to the next slide, please. So when Customs and Border Protection has a reasonable suspicion of forced labor in a garment, what does that mean? It really means that when you look at these different 11 indicators of forced labor in accordance to the International Labor Organization. And I'd like to point out that it's not just with regards to labor camps, right? Physically taking a human being and forcing them to conduct labor on your behalf. Instead, there are a lot of nuances here, and there's a lot of calls out to deception and manipulation. And there are a lot of, unfortunately, bad actors who are very sophisticated in embedding forced labor in certain forms throughout various supply chains, really all over the world. So it's important that we keep in mind the developing nature of this, the dynamic nature, and the huge emphasis that we're seeing coming out of government and private actors. So how do you deal with that, right? So I think it's important to point out a few different key pieces. So number one, of course, there's the compliance and monitoring. You know, when you're looking at the different legal requirements, both in the US as well as abroad, of course, you need to have robust compliance actions, monitoring on a periodic basis, et cetera. One thing you'll see is there's been a lot of discussion, and there has been coming out from Customs and Border Protection, indications that a third-party auditor's report is not sufficient. And that's very important to understand, but also to contextualize. It doesn't mean that third-party audit reports are not helpful at all. What it means is that it's just one part of a robust program, and it's one part of the puzzle. So other things that you can do to have a robust forced labor enforcement and prevention program within your company includes being creative. So one company I was told is at the end of the day, they're taking a picture of the assembly line. And then in the beginning of the next day, they take another photograph where things moved around overnight. You know, was somebody potentially there that you're not aware of? Practicality, also really important to bring to your analysis. So even when you're negotiating the agreements with suppliers, think about whether it's actually, you know, possible to produce the amount of output that you're asking for, given the amount of hours and people and costs that you're seeing. So try to be a bit, you know, employ your common sense rationality. Comprehensive support. So again, it's so dynamic right now. Customs and Border Protection does have some, you know, helpful suggestions, et cetera, but they don't really stick to a list of, okay, if you do X, Y, and Z, you're good. So it's important to understand that you should document any efforts that you're undertaking in order to make sure that you're not having forced labor within your supply chains. Even those creative kind of out of the box approaches, I would certainly document. And finally, novel approach to transparency, kind of pulling that together. You know, we are, with regards to forced labor, we're somewhere where we haven't really been before. And with the emphasis and with all the different actors and factors lining up together. So it's important to not just think about what we've done before, but rather think of some new approaches, such as taking another look at your contract, putting more emphasis on transparency, demanding more information from your suppliers that maybe you hadn't before. Maybe you think they don't want to give to you, but at the end of the day, if the world is changing and the risks are changing, you can change as well, and your suppliers may have to change their expectations as well. And Karen, you can just go to the last slide. Thank you. So really briefly, to step out of forced labor and move a bit more broad, right? In terms of sustainability, we talked through a whole bunch of issues, whether it's with regards to environmental sustainability or sustainability in the broader sense, covering the social, environmental, and economic factors. At the end of the day, you walk away from this presentation and you hear so many interesting, important opinions and facts, and you think, okay, what should I do? What products should I buy? What should I wear? What, as a company, you know, if I'm a corporate decision maker, which suppliers should I work with? Where should I source my goods? How should I produce my products? And so I leave you with a few kind of takeaways, right? First of all, think really holistically. with regards to sustainability. And that's really in two senses of the term holistic. First of all, as we talked about, not just focusing on one specific issue. So if you're looking at sustainability with regards to the design of your product or the materials you're using, that's awesome, but try to think throughout your supply chain from design to consumption, including transportation, etc., and really thinking holistically, as well as not just limiting yourself to environmental sustainability, but moving out and including forced labor and other factors. Communicate effectively. So you put all this work into understanding and trying to expend all these resources with regards to sustainability. Make sure you're taking that extra minute to effectively communicate it to your consumers, because they want to recognize that added value, because that's what it is today, right? We are seeing consumers expecting and seeking out more sustainable products. So if you have a more sustainable product in a number of ways, try to explain that so the consumer can appreciate the added value and potentially they'd be willing to spend a bit more or potentially pick your product over a competitor. And similarly, if you're the consumer, read the fine print. So, I mean, every day I open an email and I have a sustainable shirt in front of me or a sustainable brand. Everyone is sustainable. And it's important to click into their website at the least and look, what are they saying is sustainable about their products? How are they sustainable, etc. So do a little bit of research. I'm not saying you have to spend hours and hours, but at least understand with regard to their claim, what are they referring to? How do they define sustainability? And really finally, I think that it's important to understand we are not at a place, and I think Andrea spoke to this really great, we are not at a place where we can be perfect with regards to sustainability. And it's important when you're hearing all the noise and you're maybe feeling like it's unattainable sometimes, keep in mind that what we're seeking is progress and not perfection. And the way that we get to that sustainable world that we kind of dream of, right, is by seeking that progress, driving the innovation, and hopefully getting those research and development and technology innovations together that then enable that sustainable world. So I'll wrap it up there and hand it back to Karen.
Thank you so much, Sara. And thank you to all of our panelists. I'm sure I echo what the participants are thinking. We really appreciate all of you for your time. This was really valuable information. And I loved hearing from each of you to hear, different perspectives and different takes on how you're seeing sustainability in the fashion world, affecting your work and our lives, and just learning more about what each of us can do to make this world more sustainable and to make our fashion choices more sustainable. With that, we do have a few minutes left, and I would like to open it up to some Q&A. I did see some questions come in through the chat, so I would like to start with that first. You'll just bear with me for 1 second. Okay. Sorry, there we go. Okay, so we had the first question was for Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, the question is, if tariffs add such cost, which she said, I have no idea, can ethical labor advocates assume that garment workers make even less per garment than we imagine, materials, shipping, and tariffs? How can it all fit into inexpensive clothes? So I invite Elizabeth to answer, but I'm sure some of the other panelists as well may want to add on to that if you have any other thoughts as well.
I can't really speak to what a garment worker is making in each of these foreign countries. I mean, the average labor changes very much from country to country. But I would like to say that when it's working well, it is a source of industry and a source of jobs for people who may otherwise not have industry. And, rising tides lift all boats, right? And if it's really working well, it's very win-win. And it's able to provide different types of benefits, not only jobs, but also, for example, health benefits that these people just simply may not have access to, or financial literacy. In many countries, women don't even have a bank account, don't even know how to use an ATM. And from a Western perspective, that's very foreign to us because it feels so second nature. But we've been involved in programs where we teach women how to do that, and we hand women the paycheck to these particular women. Sometimes the husbands come to collect the paycheck, and you can say, no, you're not the recipient of the paycheck. It's the women who earned this money. And we find that when we do that and when we foster this education, it really empowers the community, because women are more likely to spend money and to reinvest in their family, in their community. So while I can't speak to the labor costs, I can say that when it's done well, it's a terrific situation where everybody benefits.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Does anyone want to add on to that before I go on to the next question?
I'll just say that I added a link in the chat for a great video. It's called The Story of Stuff. And it really is interesting talking about consumerism in general and how the US culture really pushes us to consume things, and the true cost of it isn't accounted for in the price. So I found that to be a really helpful video.
Thank you, Andrea. Okay, I'm going to go with another question from the chat. I think maybe we can see if Hanna can tackle this first, but again, all the presenters may have some thoughts on this. And the question is, when you think about the use of marketing and greenwashing and see what could be possible with blockchain, so few brands offer supply chain transparency on a small level, nevertheless, the level that blockchain technology can or would offer. How can consumers meaningfully encourage brands to be more open about their sourcing and supply chains in order for us to buy according to our values? So I see this as kind of like, how can you see sustainability kind of driving, how are consumers influencing sustainability with their purchasing choices? Hanna, are you on?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, that's a great question. And I think that we have a lot more power than we imagine. And we just need to get that conversation going and to sort of, I'm an economist, so everything I do, I think about as incentives, right? But just asking the question, and there is a learning sort of, there's a learning process in this. So once you start knowing about a product, and once you, for example, start knowing that some products will put information on the blockchain, such as this was not made by child labor, or this was not made by forced labor, and there is information that's traceable and that's trustworthy on it. As a consumer, you probably didn't think about that. When you were making the choice to buy this ball or that ball, you probably were just thinking about the prices. But once someone says, hey, I'm made, slave free, then you're starting to think, wow, what's going on with the other one, right? I didn't even know that was an issue. And so I think, to me, that's like revolutionary, how we as consumers then start thinking about this. And then asking for it, putting the demand out there, putting that question to the retailer and to the producer, and just having that question out there, I think is very, very powerful.
Thank you, Hanna.
Karen, I can speak real quickly as well. I think that, again, we're kind of moving in that great direction. I think also it's important to understand that, as Hanna spoke to, blockchain has a lot of opportunities, and we do see a lot of potential there, but one piece of the puzzle is not going to solve the whole problem. So, you have your issues no matter what. I think it's kind of that big picture piece that we need to keep in mind, that we're kind of going in the right direction. But if you have a blockchain technology that's installed within a company's system, you still might have, that piece of, okay, who's putting the information in, what is really happening on the ground versus what's showing up in the blockchain. And there are a number of individuals, including Hanna, who are working through those issues right now and trying to get to that place where we can really utilize blockchain and other technologies. But again, there's other technologies as well, just kind of automation and other capabilities that are moving us towards that transparency that we seek. So I think from a consumer perspective, try to, again, do just a bit of research on the brands that you're purchasing from, where your goods coming from, who's manufacturing them and how. And then by choosing the right, choosing the brands that you feel align with your values and what you think is the right direction, you'll be able to drive that change as well.
And even if you can't do that from the beginning, just asking the question, right? Stopping to, I would like to know more about this project.
Yep.
Thank you so much. I know we are at the top of the hour and we have a lot of participants still on, so I think we'll just take a couple more questions. I do have one for Andrea, which is, how have you seen sustainability change or evolve during the pandemic? And do you think those changes are permanent? Are they changes for the better or for worse? Just curious for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's hard for me to answer that because sometimes I feel like I'm in such a sustainable bubble, right? I've really built a community around people who are so conscious and maybe the toughest consumers. But I will say a lot of the times I get a better pulse of what's going on when I look at the universities and colleges that I teach at. And, just a comparison of when I was a student at FIT, raising my hand about fair trade or what about the ethics, and the professor saying, hand down, we're not talking about that, to now where at LAM College, sustainability and the future of fashion is a required course. And so many of the students are thinking of sustainability not as an additional feature, but as a core foundation, right, of what their business is going to be built upon. So that is very encouraging that so many people at that younger level, and I think to echo what Hanna was saying of, asking that question, I really tell students when they go to an interview, right? And you're supposed to ask one or two questions at the end when it's kind of flipped on you, and you say to them, or you should say, so what is your sustainability plan? Or what is your CSR plan? And maybe they won't have an answer, and maybe it'll be a little uncomfortable silence. But I'm sure for that next interview that they conduct, maybe they will come up with an answer. So that's also pushing, employers and, companies and brands to think that this is something that is also an offering for future talent. So I'd like to think of it that way as well.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm even thinking too with the pandemic and, basically a lot of international travel being shut down, that companies can't do the site visits that they used to do, or at least they're greatly decreased. And maybe things will be changing as things start to open up a lot more, but that will be also interesting and hopefully a positive change as well.
Yeah, and I think things, progressed in certain ways last year and got held back in certain ways. So I think so many of us had more time to research. So researching the products that we came from, but certainly our consumption of e-commerce was propelled very much so. But then I look at an organization like the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. And the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, they were set to release a lot of data. So this is a coalition started by Walmart and Patagonia. And they have certified factories and a lot of tools and a lot of resources and a lot of members and partners that were collecting information from factories all around the world. And they had to put a pause on releasing this data because as soon as the pandemic hit, supply chains were thrown out of whack, and access to the factories and gathering this information was put on hold. So hopefully a coalition like that and that tool and that information they were going to come out with won't be held up much longer, because that is going to be a really powerful tool, not just for consumers, but for designers and people here doing the product development to shape their understanding of what products their environmental and social implications are.
Thank you, Andrea. And just a last question to Sara. Do you have any recommendations for either people wanting to learn more about this topic or wanting to, enter into this field? Do you have any recommendations or advice for some of our participants.
Thank you, Karen, for that little pitch. So I guess, of course, I'll speak to the organization which I founded this year, the tradeimpact.org. You can go to the Trade Impact Foundation's website at thetradeimpact.org. And what's been interesting is, my background is in international trade consulting and law. And I think a lot of people this past year have began to think about sustainability in a different way. And the way that I did it was, well, how can I take my background and contribute to this kind of vision? And so I think, whatever your background is, whatever your interests are, I think there's a way to get involved with sustainability and continue to learn. I mean, I think every time you pick up a newspaper or look on a website, sustainability is everywhere. But again, I would suggest to do your own research, think about it a little bit analytically. A lot of the panelists talk to the fact that it's so dynamic and things are changing. One thing that's coming out now is all the discussions on, ESG impact investment. You'll see a lot of discussions with regards to carbon neutrality, your carbon footprint. And one thing I just want to add that I don't think we really covered too much is just understanding when a company says they're carbon neutral, understanding that might be, it's not necessarily that they're not contributing any carbon from their manufacturing, but rather on a net basis because of activities they're doing with regards to planting trees or other activities. They're kind of putting together this carbon neutrality plan. And that's fantastic, but it's something you should understand and not just see, okay, you're sustainable, I'm done, check, I'm gonna support you, but rather think about what are your values, how you think that we should be promoting sustainability, and trying to find those who align with what you're doing. So do your own research, check out the tradeimpact.org absolutely, and feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn as well for further discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And just for everyone, I did put in the chat a link to a PDF of this presentation, and there's a link to the presenter bios. Within those bios, there are also hot links to everyone's organizations if you'd like to learn more, as Sarah mentioned. And I also have links to our 3 co-sponsors as well. So I encourage everyone to click on those before we close this out and check them out. And with that, I would love to thank everyone for joining. This has been a great discussion and hopefully just the beginning of many more. So thank you so much to our panelists for all the great content and discussion today.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.